Hey guys, Mana here bringing you another guide. This time I'm going to be talking about some of the pros and cons of Warlocks in endgame PvE. Now, I'm not going to be talking about some of the basic utility stuff like Health Stones, Soulstone Battle Reses, Summoning Stones, and of course the honor of having a Warlock in your raid. I'm going to be focusing on some of the pros and cons for Warlocks when dealing with these endgame PvE encounters in order to give you an idea of what your strengths and weaknesses are so that you know what you should be abusing and taking advantage of and what you should try to be on the lookout for so you don't completely mess up. Alright, so to start off with the strengths, by now most people would probably agree that Warlocks have arguably the best mana pools in the game. Not only do we have Life Tap, which is especially powerful for Affliction thanks to improved Life Tap, Demonology and Destruction have Mana Feed, and Destruction provides Replenishment. So as a Warlock, one of your advantages is that you should never really have to worry about your mana pool. Okay, so next up, Warlocks are also incredibly sturdy and self-sufficient. We receive less damage thanks to Soul Link, and we're always healing ourselves thanks to all the tools available to each spec. All Warlocks heal through Fell Armor, but Affliction has Siphon Life and Haunt, Demonology has additional self-healing from Fell Armor, and Destruction has Soul Leech. It's true that Warlocks do lose some health from life tapping, but the reduced damage and self-healing are more than enough to handle someone who uses life tap correctly, and because of this reduced damage and self-healing, it's really common for good Warlocks to stay alive in cases where other classes would die, so this is actually a really big advantage in my opinion for Warlocks. Alright, next up, Warlocks have very strong multi-target and AoE specs. As far as I know, Warlocks are the only pure DPS class that have 3 competitive DPS specs in endgame PvE, regardless of the encounter. Except maybe Hunters, but then again, at this point, what don't Hunters have? But yeah, Affliction and Destruction do very well on single-target and dual-target fights, and Demonology is widely considered to be the most powerful AoE spec in the game. So as a Warlock, we're pretty lucky because in my opinion, we're free to choose the spec we prefer and still be competitive on the DPS meters. Alright, next up is DPS remains strong with movement. Thanks to the large amount of instant cast spells at our disposal, Warlocks tend to continue performing well even when constantly moving. The exception to this would be Demonology, thanks to Demonology really needing to make the absolute best use of Metamorphosis and other cooldowns together. So moving during this is pretty bad. However, if you correctly anticipate when you're going to be moving and time your cooldowns for when you know you're going to be standing still, you can reduce the DPS loss from movement as Demonology, at least to some degree anyway. But generally speaking, Warlocks have plenty of tools available that allow them to maintain solid DPS even if they have to move. Just remember that when you're moving, you can still refresh dots, regain mana from Life Tap, or use Fell Flames. Alright, so finally, this one should be a no-brainer, but Teleport is an awesome spell, and it's probably one of the least correctly used spells in the game. A lot of players tend to just put it in useless places, and even when they put it in useful places, most of them just forget that they can teleport, or they don't teleport when they need to. So it's understandable, but proper use of Teleport can oftentimes increase DPS by drastically reducing movement, or it can even trivialize certain boss mechanics. For instance, on Alakir, a Warlock can place a portal where they stand, and as soon as Alakir uses his Windburst, you can immediately teleport, which almost completely removes that mechanic for Warlocks. So you should definitely look to make use of Teleport as much as possible. It's an incredibly useful ability. Alright, now for what I would consider to be some of the more significant cons to playing a Warlock. So one of the main things with Warlocks is that we focus a lot on damage over time spells, or dots. Destruction and Demonology less so than Affliction, but still. Generally speaking, all 3 specs have their fair share of dots, and thus they tend to suffer from ramp-up time. Of course, this isn't really that big of a deal on a boss fight where damage dealers get plenty of time to let their damage average out or build up, but really it's just something to keep in mind. As a Warlock, you won't really get the chance to just pop some cooldowns at the beginning of a fight and get a ton of quote-unquote free DPS. Even Demonology, which has arguably the strongest opening thanks to all the cooldowns at the beginning, it has a slow start compared to some other classes. Warlocks are typically the ones that have to start out slow and very slowly climb up on damage. So as a Warlock, you have to remain consistent all throughout the fight. Alright, next up is what I would consider to be the punishing spell priorities that Warlocks have. Each Warlock spec has a decently challenging spell priority, which is fine, but mistakes end up being very costly. Missing a dot application or even refreshing a dot too early will result in a pretty big DPS loss. Affliction has the difficulty of maintaining 3 stacks of Shadow Embrace on multi-target fights. Destruction has a somewhat dynamic spell priority, but also has to maintain improved Soulfire. And Demonology has to stack their Metamorphosis, which has an inconsistent cooldown with as many other cooldowns as possible. So there's a lot of minor things that can happen that will result in a big DPS loss for Warlocks. So honestly, it's about limiting your mistakes as much as possible, because there will be mistakes. Alright, so this next one's probably a little bit controversial, so I'll try to explain it a little bit carefully. Warlocks, specifically Affliction and Demonology, have an execute phase, and in my opinion, that hurts progression raiders. During progression, a group will slowly work through a boss fight, and for difficult encounters, they won't be reaching the 25% mark for quite a while. And this is going to hurt your performance since your damage is balanced around maintaining damage at the 25% mark. So your damage is balanced around having an execute phase, and for most of progression, you're not going to be reaching that execute phase for a while. But to be fair, on the other hand, if your group is struggling with a boss after the 25% mark, having an execute phase like Affliction and Demonology will favor your group since it means you're going to get through that part a little bit faster. So, at any rate, I'm not trying to say that Warlock should or shouldn't have that execute phase. I'm just saying that since Affliction and Demonology do have that execute phase, you should keep it in mind during progression rating. And finally, one of the more significant downsides to playing a Warlock is that by playing a Warlock, you're automatically not using a Mage or a Hunter. And it's usually considered a DPS loss to use a Warlock instead of a Mage or a Hunter. So when you're using a Warlock, you should keep that in mind. And all sarcasm aside, those are, in my opinion, the most notable pros and cons when it comes to Warlocks, except maybe that last one, but really, who knows. If you guys have any questions, you can leave them in the comments below or send me a private message. And as always, if you enjoyed what you saw, feel free to like and to subscribe. Later, guys.